what an incredible panel to cover proof of reserves. It's one of the things that I've been fighting for years in the industry, trying to get exchanges to do it. And of course, post-FTX is incredibly important. And luckily, more and more exchanges are doing it. So we have a representative from Texas who's introduced some legislation asking for exchanges there to do proof of reserves. We have a representative of Binance, the largest exchange in the world, and they have an active proof of reserve product. And of course, Brian from KPMG, which is one of the leading firms on the accounting side pushing forward proof of reserve. So, incredibly relevant panelists here. Really excited for the discussion. So, Brian, I think we'll start with you. So, there's been a lot of noise about proof of reserve. What actually does it mean, and what is the purpose of proof of reserve? Why do people ask for it?
Yeah, so effectively, proof of reserve is an audit that crypto companies will undergo to demonstrate that the assets or the deposits that their customers are placing under their custody are in fact there. I kind of view it as a way of demonstrating the company's solvency in the event that any of these customers want to withdraw their assets, and especially in the event that many of those customers decide to withdraw their assets. I think if you go back a few months looking at the situation with FTX, I think that's a clear use case of where proof of reserves would have been very beneficial. I believe at the time, I think they were on the hook for about $1 billion, let's just say, worth of customer Bitcoin, and they had one. So I think if they were undergoing a proof of reserve, I think the alarms would have gone off much sooner. And I think it's a way to really instill trust back in customers who want to place their assets with these custodians.
So, Rana, you work for Binance on the public policy team. Binance has been really active in pursuing proof of reserves. You had a rollout a few months ago. You've recently updated it. Tell us about your thinking and why you would invest so many resources into proof of reserve, which presumably is just a cost center for the business.
I think the past year has underscored the importance of building trust in the industry and demonstrating to users that they can trust centralized exchanges or any player that they use to hold their crypto, that their assets are held indeed one-to-one in their safekeeping. And proof of reserves is our way to do that. We've built the technology, and a lot of other exchanges have also built various proof of reserve systems to demonstrate that assets are indeed held in safekeeping one-to-one, and that users can withdraw their assets at any given point.
And this is something that's sort of uniquely possible with crypto assets. I mean, it's not something you can easily do with dollars in the bank account or gold in the vault. It's the auditability function that actually allows us to do this, right?
Yeah, and someone said it earlier on a panel, mathematics and technology and cryptographic technology specifically has enabled new ways to demonstrate that trust and give users the assurance that they need that their assets are held in safekeeping. So users can now, because of blockchain technology and the inherent transparency that comes with it, and on top of that, new technologies such as Merkle trees and zero-knowledge proof systems like ZK Snarks, which I'm happy to nerd out about anytime, have enabled us to mathematically prove that the assets are indeed held in safekeeping. And it's a theme that several other panelists touched on earlier throughout the day.
So, Representative, I'm really glad you could join us today. I think the bill that you authored and proposed in Texas is the first of its kind in terms of in any state legislature or at the federal level. So tell us a little bit about how that came to be and why proof of reserve is a priority for you.
Sure. And I guess I'll start with, you had mentioned gold. So a few years back, I created the first and only state-run bullion depository in Texas, where we wanted to make sure that if people wanted to put their precious metals in a vault, they would have proof that their assets were there. It was auditable, the cameras, that there was no way to borrow or sell forwards or futures on that gold. I've spent a lot of time in my personal life as a compliance officer in various funds. And obviously, I'm the chair of the IT caucus, so I want to make sure that in Texas, we don't over-regulate things and we allow technology and technologists to be innovative. So when I saw, obviously, current events and even some some during the summer and even before that, where we saw and I saw some companies just not following basic governance, basic fiduciary responsibilities that would be relevant in any other company. I felt that there was an opportunity in Texas to be able to come up with some amount of regulation, some amount of minimal regulation that we could pass in Texas that would provide people more assurance that whether it's an exchange or some of these other digital asset providers, we're actually taking care and having proof of reserves and other items that are in our bill.
And proof of reserves is still a somewhat novel concept, even though in crypto circles it's existed since 2013, but I don't believe that it's really mainstream yet. How did your colleagues react when you introduced this legislation?
Well, it's kind of interesting because in the legislature, at least in the House, there's 150 of us. We all come from different backgrounds. Some are banking professionals, some are brain surgeons, some are restaurant owners. So part of the challenge at first, and it's probably the challenge for all of you as well, is trying to get the whole entire concept of everything from blockchain to cryptocurrency to get people educated on what that is and why it's necessary. But as I've worked on the bill, we've been able to go and educate certain members as the votes come up. So yesterday, so it's my bill, and I happen to be the chairman of the Investment and Financial Services Committee, so obviously the bill came to our committee, and so it passed out of our committee, which is the first step, 7-0 yesterday.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, the next step is it goes to calendars, and then after that it goes to the full House floor for a vote.
So assuming it passes, this is a landmark piece of legislation. I think it really shows leadership from Texas, which is, of course, one of the most friendly states for crypto. Is this something you expect to see replicated in other states or even in Congress?
Well, that's why I'm here, partly because I work on other IT-related things that I hoped that the federal government would go and work on, but I know the challenges that they face in getting, whether it's compromise or negotiate those types of deals. But my goal is for this legislation like I've written or similar to start passing in other states, right? Because that is the fastest way that we're going to get that trust back and help our customers.
So Brian, let's go to you. You sit inside the Big Four, and there's an interesting discussion and debate in the industry over whether proof of reserve works as a technology tool, or whether it can stand alone, or whether it requires auditor oversight. The more complex it is, probably the more case to having an auditor oversee the process. And from exchanges, we've seen a mixture. We've seen some that have not been overseen, some that have. What would you say is the importance of having an auditor involved in the process and overseeing it?
Sure. So I'd say this is, again, my personal opinion, but to me, it just feels like a natural fit to have a third-party auditor who has the deep expertise on how to conduct these types of procedures, how to conduct them in a consistent manner. I think the other thing that a lot of times I think people lose sight of when it comes to a proof of reserve audit is demonstrating, to Rana's point, using Merkle trees, that sort of thing, that everything is included. Well, one of the biggest sides of the equation is the liability side. And I think when you start looking at the liability side, you start really requiring a lot more in-depth procedures to need to be performed, those types of procedures that have historically been conducted by auditing firms like KPMG. So I think that's something that fits in really well in their wheelhouse, because I think in order to have an effective proof of reserve result, for that matter, you really need both of those, because if you go do a proof of reserve and you show that you have, let's just say, $1 million of asset X, but you're really supposed to have 2 times that because you didn't look at the liability side, I think that would be one of the shortcomings of it.
And for the panel, how would you compare the assurances you get from a proof of reserve to the assurances you get from a traditional financial statement audit? Brian, maybe we can start with you again there.
Yeah, so a traditional financial statement audit is going to be much more comprehensive. I feel like a proof of reserve is a much more narrowly scoped type of engagement. When you get into financial statement audits, you're covering quite a number of things, the income statement, the balance sheet, et cetera, et cetera. And that's something that is conducted for the entire audit period, which typically is 12 months. Proof of reserves are going to be something that's conducted as a point in time, which is, again, one of the other drawbacks, and I think something that has created some questions in the industry is how often should you do them? So, for example, if you were to conduct a proof of reserve audit, let's say annually or even quarterly, well, there's a lot of risk that the company you're conducting that audit on could move assets right before the audit and then subsequently move them right afterwards. So you're given a very kind of false perception at that point in time.
Representative, what kind of assurances would Texans have once your bill is law and exchange is implemented?
So an independent audit is part of that. We talked about a quarterly audit, but also we have upon demand. Obviously, anyone can validate and verify what liabilities are attached to each account, what their current asset holdings are. I mean, again, these are kind of, when you look at what was done wrong in other cases, this is kind of the minimal expectation that at least my constituents want, is to be able to, at any time, make sure that what they bought is really there.
Rana, tell us a little bit more about Binance's implementation, how you went about solving this problem, and what information your customers ultimately derive from that.
So the goal for any proof of reserve system is primarily to demonstrate to users that their assets are safe, that they're held one-to-one. And some of the earlier proof of reserve systems relied only on Merkle tree technology. I mean, the simplest way to do it is on-chain information says that a given exchange needs to hold a certain amount of, for example, Bitcoin, to take an example. And you can just publish a list of user balances and show that they add to 100 Bitcoin. But then you would have to tell everyone how much Bitcoin each user of the exchange holds. That's the simplest way to do it. So Merkle trees emerged as a way to anonymize some of that information to show that all users' assets are held in custody without showing the full set of information and protect users' privacy. Now, even with Merkle trees, there are some limitations. To Brian's point, classic Merkle trees cannot prove that a user doesn't have a negative balance, that exchanges don't lend without collateral. And it also, in order to show the full information, which is a Merkle sum tree, to show that the balances of the users add up to the claimed value that should match the on-chain reserves, you would have to disclose too much about other users, even within a Merkle tree setup, and that is not ideal in terms of privacy leakage. Malicious users that control more than one account could potentially work back too much about other user balances. And this is why Binance, we originally released a Merkle tree proof of reserve system, and we continue to improve that throughout several iterations. We don't update it annually, like a lot happens in crypto in 1 year. We update it actually much more regularly than that, every few weeks. But ever since our very first version, we've recently introduced a zero-knowledge proof-based Merkle tree solution. So it's a classic Merkle tree, but on top of that, you add a layer of zero-knowledge proof, one of the types of which is ZK Snarks. You might have seen that catchy acronym on one of Nick's blogs. And what you would do with that is you can demonstrate that no user, in order for the Merkle tree to be created in the first place, no user has a negative balance, meaning that exchanges do not lend without collateral, and that all the user balances indeed add up to the claim total. We can do that through zero-knowledge proof, which is immutable. It would require an unfathomable amount of computing power to spoof that today, even with the current setups. And you can demonstrate it through the technology on top of the existing Merkle tree. The problem with all of what I just said is it's a little complicated. It's probably not a story for the average user that just wants to make sure that their life savings that they've decided to invest in crypto is safe. So a lot of education is needed. We need to unpack the technology, explain what it does, and until people get to trust that, it is important to look at auditors, and the two things go hand in hand. The two things are complementary.
So you're right to declare it complicated, because it is. Do you expect that your ordinary users will perform this verification to check that their liabilities are included in the liability set, or is it just something you reserve for power users, funds? How do you expect them to hold you accountable?
Our goal is to offer the assurance to everyone that's looking for it. And that includes both power users and ordinary users. So we're trying to make it as more user-friendly as possible, our current system. But I think more importantly, building the trust that we have the technology in place and unpacking the technology itself, showing that people can trust in the code, trust in the mathematics behind it. Maybe they need to run it to see for themselves that their assets are held in safekeeping, and maybe they trust in the technology as long as they understand it. So our goal is to offer it to whoever is seeking the assurance.
Representative, in your bill, how do audit firms participate? Or do they have a role, or are you expecting the exchanges themselves just to produce the proofs?
No, I think that's what's been missing before, and so I've always said the fastest. If you're ever as a legislator, if you're ever in your office and you're bored, you just have to file a bill, and a lot of people will come running to your office, and so we've had a lot of input from everyone, from obviously digital asset providers, but also other people in the industry. We've heard some from banks and from bigger money management advisors. And so what we've done is we've kind of come to the conclusion that the best way to do this is that they will have to go and get an independent audit. Obviously, the company has to provide, just like they should, which is here are our processes, here are our procedures, this is how we do things, this is how we count, this is, I think you get as complicated as you can with auditors, and then let them go and verify, right? That's the title of this panel, right? To go and verify that those processes and procedures were followed and that the numbers tie and they match up. And we just don't have any auditor. Obviously, it has to be someone who's certified and doesn't have to necessarily be KPMG, but it has to be someone who's a legitimate audit firm that then goes through and does the full analysis. And then that report is available for everyone, but very specifically for our state agency regulators, who will then go and validate and verify that everything was done and it's in good standing.
If I may add to that, I think one challenge that we grapple with is that there are no specific standards, global auditing standards for crypto. And there are some intricacies with the industry and the asset classes that are very specific to the kind of assurances that we need to provide users. And until the standards catch up globally, it has kind of fallen to the exchanges to create them. And show what good looks like, and show why users and how users can trust that their assets are held in safekeeping. We've made, our current proof of reserve system was actually proposed, the technology was originally proposed by Vitalik, specifically the part where you use zero knowledge proof to address the limitations of a classic Merkle tree. Binance, we built it and we put it out there as open source, and we encourage every other centralized exchange to adopt it. And not only that, take it, improve on it, build, maybe find another limitation that we weren't aware of, address that, and raise the tide for the whole industry in terms of what kind of assurances this system provides and could provide in the future too.
Yeah, that's an excellent point about the lack of standardization. It's interesting. It's like a handful of enthusiasts trying to. I think actually the Chamber paper, which described proof of reserve formally, was the first white paper that covered it in a kind of academic style. And there's been very little academia on it. And the implementations come to the exchanges, and they end up being disparate just because the exchanges have different tech stacks and just different approaches to the problem. And even at the auditor level, at the regulators that regulate the auditors, there's been no mention, really, of proof of reserve yet. So Brian, how does this affect you from your seat in the Big Four, the general lack of standardization of proof of reserve? Is that a hindrance to sort of your ability to go in and to cover these attestations that the exchanges do?
Yep, so back in November, we started to see a lot of activity, a lot of discussions around proof of reserve. That was clearly a very hot topic at the time for obvious reasons. I think where Big Four firms like KPMG are going to struggle to get into this place are just like what Rana said, there's no standard to issue an opinion against. So, I've talked about financial statement audits. When companies issue an opinion on financial statements, they're issued against a specific standard, which ensures that if my company is getting audited versus your company getting audited, it's being done in a consistent manner. I'll kind of pull on the example, Nick. I know you've done a good amount of work in this space, and you kind of went through some of the proof of reserves that the different exchanges had done, and you kind of ranked them. The fact that you're ranking them kind of demonstrates that there's no consistency in this industry, because when you go look at the financial statements of Apple versus the financial statements of Amazon, you don't question if Amazon did theirs differently than Apple's. That would be a pretty big advantage that one of those companies get. So I think it's very important if we are to have formal standards around proof of reserves. I think auditors will then be able to start issuing formal attestation type reports against those.
Yeah, I think one of the real challenges in the industry right now is the exchanges having a hard time finding CPA firms. In your legislation, is there any provision for this, or is it just you expect that once that becomes law, CPA firms will realize, hey, there's a market opportunity here?
No, you're right. I mean, our expectation is that firms will find audit firms, work with them, and come up with reports. Okay. Here's the thing. I mean, there's a lot of complicated businesses. I've been on kind of the receiving end of many audits for dozens of different types of companies. This is different, but it's not magical, right? There are ways to go and validate and verify if someone has assets, that those assets are there, and that they own them. I mean, but also keep in mind that it's not foolproof, right? There are a lot of people who walked into Silicon Valley Bank on Friday morning, deposited stuff, and then saw in the news that it was gone, right? And that's a highly regulated, highly audited, reports every single day type of thing. What we're trying to do is say, listen, at a bare minimum, I bought this. Do I have it? Can you prove that that exists, that there's not enough liabilities outstanding where I won't be able to receive what I have? And if there's a technology that's able to do it, again, to me, a lot of the audits are done is what the company's saying and how they do it accurate. And at a minimum, that should be the standard, even if it's just, hey, they're saying you have this, they have that.
Brian, when you look at these proofs of reserve, we just said they're quite heterogeneous. Are there a set of things that you look for? Is there some notion of sufficiency in a proof of reserve in terms of frequency, asset coverage, demonstration of the liabilities, whether it's just to clients or whether it's to the whole general public? Are there specific things that you would look for in a proof of reserve?
Yeah, so I think it's an evolving space, right? I think a lot of us who are working on this, either through our working group with the chamber, et cetera, are trying to figure out what is the right mix, to your point, of the frequency, how often it's done, how are you auditing the liabilities, are you using Merkle trees, ZK snarks, as Rana alluded to. I think as this space becomes more mature, and by that space I mean the proof of reserves, I think my hope is that a group like the AICPA kind of volunteers to do this, because I think they're one of the best, I'll call them, standard setters in our space, and I think that's going to allow us to work with them to make sure that we include the right things that need to be covered, because I think it's a slippery slope when you start letting these companies do it the way they see fit, because again, it's just going to create very inconsistent results from one company to the next.
Can I just? Yeah. One other thing is, we'll pass this law. It'll be effective September 1st of next year, which the clock is ticking, right? And this year? So it would be effective September 1st of this year. Yeah. I think we put a little window of time after that for people to get ready. But what I will say is, Texas is a pretty big market, and if you want to stay in it, we're going to have to figure out how to provide that proof of assurance and reserve to customers.
I think another thing too that's going to be important, where firms might feel that it's going to make sense for them to do these proof of reserve audits for companies where they're already doing the financial statement audit. So they're already already engaged with these companies. They're already auditing liabilities to begin with. So I think the proof of reserve becomes just an incremental procedure that gets done. And I think that makes for a much more effective approach than having two disparate firms looking at two different things simultaneously.
Rana, you've shown that you can considerably evolve your proof of reserve implementation. We've seen a lot of changes from you. We've seen it from other exchanges that have gone to the ZK liability method, which allows you potentially to expose all the user liabilities without leaking any data. So I think it's a really strong technological development. When you look forward, are there any other additions or changes you'd like to make to your implementation? Maybe it's on frequency. Could we move to real-time proof of reserve? What do you expect there technologically?
So we're continuing to improve and evolve our proof of reserve system. Most recently, about a couple of weeks ago, we launched the latest iteration of it, which covers at this point over 80% of our asset holdings, over 24 tokens, amounting to about $63 billion. So continuing that coverage to cover the longer tail of tokens. And expanding that to include all of our assets is definitely one. We're also looking into ways we can improve the zero-knowledge proof system that we're using and make it as trustless as possible. So moving from ZK snarks to adding multi-party computation is something that we're actively exploring. And the idea of that is the validation of the extra layer of zero-knowledge proof that we're adding to prove no negative balances and that totals add up to what they're supposed to would not just be based on keys generated by the exchanges, but would be based on keys generated by additional validators too. So moving to even more trustless versions of the technology and continuing to educate people on what it actually does. Like we can put a lot of fancy acronyms and say that we're building something foolproof, you gotta trust us, but we can't just do that. We have to continue to explain what it is and make it as trustless and as unlinked to the exchange itself as possible. And what Vitalik calls that is moving from don't be evil, like exchanges doing things like choosing not to be evil, choosing not to use user assets fraudulently, and them like trying to get users to trust them, to can't be evil setups. Like we couldn't even spoof the system if we wanted to because the setup is trustless and doesn't allow us to do that in the first place. And that's something Vitalik talks about a lot.
So as we wrap here, where does proof of reserve leave us as an industry? We've seen a lot of firms doing it. We'll now see the states start to ask these firms to do it. What's our level of progress and how far along are we in terms of getting to a trustless crypto ecosystem for the panel?
I think we're early, right? Again, I just keep coming back to the fact that I think companies really started to place emphasis on proof of reserves just in the last, let's say, 6 months. I think as more of them start to publish their results, and I think kind of make sure that they're battle tested with the public, and they can take some of that feedback publicly, and also see what their competitors are doing. I think that's gonna add a lot of value, and I think that's going to be the best thing we can do, shy of having formal standards that govern this.
I think proof of reserves is table stakes for any centralized exchange at this point, and it's, as Brian said, early days, but also one building block of a broader effort that should be across the industry to build trust. So risk management, good corporate hygiene, continuing to explain and educate users how products work and how they can ensure the safety of their assets, I think is a journey that all exchanges should be on.
I think from my perspective, obviously what happened with FTX and others was bad PR, right, for the industry. It made a lot of people maybe not want to get involved with it, but I think this industry still has opportunities to mature, and I think by putting these new rules and new audits and these new standards in place, it's getting ready to grow tremendously.
Fantastic discussion. Thank you so much. Thank the panelists.